Hey there, welcome to episode 55 of the FFS Talk audio program. I am your host, Dan Hugo. We're recording this late in the evening of the 12th of December 12, 2024. It's a Thursday. The time as we begin is 9:52 p.m. I've said it in my other productions. I will move back to the normal AM recording soon. Today's episode is about if I could speak. Today's episode is about sources of news, sources of information. Where do we get all this stuff that YouTubers and podcasters, those crazy podcasters, where does it all come from? Or more importantly, what happens when it doesn't? If you are not familiar with the FFS Talk audio program, it is intended to be a discussion, so far historically a monologue, but a discussion ideally about what works, what does not work, and what we might do about it. So the monologues are really seeds of discussion into the future. We're banking many conversations for tomorrow. If you are not familiar with what FFS means, it is an Irish expression that you can learn more about if you hang out with more Irish people. Hopefully, wherever you found this audio program, you were able to locate the episode description, in which you will find the summary of today's episode and several links. There are only the 2 shameless self-promotion links and then 3 more. This is a topic that could quite literally run into hours and hours and hours and so many more links and deeper discussion, and maybe it will. So consider this yet another primer of future discussion. So let's begin. The summary of today's episode is there has been some talk, some concern about what happens when the big companies run out of new human-authored content to train their AI models on, and the snake begins to eat its own tail, so to speak. Might there be a similar problem for content creators if mainstream media falls behind, shrinks away, leaving your own personal Joe Rogan as your primary source of news and insights? What happens? Maybe it's Theo Vaughn. Maybe it's not Joe Rogan. There are many online new media, as it's sometimes called, new media personalities who are considered news. The links for today's episode include the shameless self-promotion to be found at buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, Ko-fi.com, Ko-fi. Should I say Ko-fi? Maybe. .com/DanHugo. You are under no obligation to spend any money at these websites, but I do use them for some outreach. The buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo profile page includes links to my various audio programs and productions and GitHub projects and whatnot. So it's an always available profile page with more. The top of the profile page includes a link to something I've recently added to the Buy Me a Coffee platform for my part. The Buy Me an Update. It's about a 5-minute micro update on the week previous. I try to publish it Monday mornings. So far, so good. So do visit those links to find out more about other audio programs. Did you know that I produce 4 audio programs per week, plus, of course, the newly minted Buy Me an Update? If you didn't know, check out buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo. And then Ko-fi.com/DanHugo, I've been posting textual updates as well. Gallup shows declining trust in mainstream. This is a link to a Gallup poll. I think this is fairly recent, maybe in the last year, but I'm not looking at it right now, but it's current. And it is, we see it reflected in the commentary that's being made lately, especially post-election 2024, where bias and various arguably malpractice like performances and so on have chipped away even more, not only at the trust in mainstream media, and I'm including cable news, 24-hour news network silliness, but also the print media, just generally the classic legacy sources of news where people used to turn, they're turning away, and that shows up in their ratings. And there have been some shakeups in editorial business and so on. So the old mainstream media business practice and resources are probably going to change. Columbia Investigative Journalism Summer Class. I do have a link to their journalism.columbia.edu site with a summer investigative reporting course. It's not from this year. I think it was from this one I do have up. I think it was from July. Yeah, July, the month of July, basically, 8 to 26, 2024. So it was from this year, but it is in the past, recent past. And I'll probably go through a couple of those bullet items just for some context about what journalism is, or what people think it might be. Podcasts as news sources. There's a new research poll on journalism. It is from 2023, so it's a year. So it's a year and a half old. Podcast as a source of news and information. The numbers are going up. You can find these polls everywhere. The general public views online content creators, especially the new media, those who are news or news commentary or so-called news analysis, are more fun. So people are watching them as primary sources of information. Perhaps The Daily Show set that in motion. It's hard to say. That's my own posit. The fact that the mainstream media news organizations were moved into the entertainment division, that is, they were to make money based on ratings, so they had to try to be entertaining and then move towards more news analysis rather than pure news reporting, which is boring. Facts are boring. That's my own editorial. May have something to do with all this. It's hard to say. But catering to an audience for the sake of ratings rather than reporting the news right down the middle, so to speak, or with an explicit and clear and obvious bias. If you've ever watched Face the Nation from the good old days, you can have a political leaning and you can make it a part of your presentation, but it should be very obvious. Do it or don't claim you're not. No, do it and don't claim you're not. Anyway, let's get on. Those are the links. Those are the links for today's episode. Let's get on with it. So how about these podcasters and vloggers and content creators and influencers? These terms are all used mostly interchangeably when it comes to any sort of talking content, although bloggers still exist. So there's written word. It could be audio only. It could be video, where the person or people in the production are speaking to each other and their audience, possibly inviting interaction via a chat tool. Of course, in the written word, you could have comments, call in sometimes, as we've found with the old radio shows for years, or perhaps coming on as a remote video guest or sitting in on an episode as an actual in-person guest. So the advent of YouTube and, of course, audio podcasting before that has made this form of media creation. So content creators creating video and audio media for the purposes of engaging their audiences with topical news items is, you could say, low-hanging fruit at this point. Anyone can do any of these things. It's pretty universally accessible. The advent of audio podcasting, named for the role Apple played connecting offline radio-like audio programs with their mobile audio player, the iPod, and later the evolution of audio podcasting into video production, still referred to as podcasting for better or worse, has enabled just about anyone with the motivation to create their own online content and, over time, develop an online following, and maybe a following in real life, to do so, just like I'm doing. I left out a couple words there in my notes. It is important, perhaps critical, to understand that anyone who makes their living as an entrepreneurial content creator, or even working as a content creator for a channel or a network or some umbrella content company, so they're not truly self-employed, but many are, they may place more importance on growing and retaining an audience for the purpose of revenue. And this is understandable. So through advertising, probably, or sometimes a subscriber, Patreon, super chats, other forms of user support, financial support, over a sense of journalistic responsibility. And that's probably the origins of that come not only from the fact that they started this business to make money, they didn't attend a journalism school, but also they didn't attend a journalism school So therefore, they don't have the basis to be a professional journalist. They only have seen one on TV. Unless a journalist is presenting information, certainly journalists are free to become content creators as well. And they identify as a journalist. That is, hey, I'm an actual journalist. And we've seen this. Matt Taibbi had an audio program he co-hosted called Useful Idiots. I think he probably found that he preferred useful over idiot, but then he did the Twitter files, and that was sort of kind of a little undoing. I think some integrity may have been lost. Anyway, some editorial there. We cannot presume that we are receiving information from a journalist and maybe getting it from an entrepreneur instead. Entrepreneurs have the best of intentions to make money and maybe to do good by their audience, but they don't necessarily know, hey, I just want to perform a little surgery just to make life a little bit easier for people. Did you go to medical school? No, but I do have a lot of likes. That's a problem. Journalism, reporting, analyzing. News analysis really took off in the 24-hour news reporting of cable news many years ago, since there was so much time to fill. They refer to it as the 24-hour news cycle. And hopefully you would respond with, isn't everything in days are 24 hours? Everything doesn't happen between 5 and 6 p.m. Eastern. So, but the fact is they had 24 hours of news reporting to fill. 24-hour news cycle became a real thing. So why not spend the rest of the available time when you're not doing hard news reporting, analyzing the news of the day, through the day and night, all the time? You can see this practice has most definitely carried over into the podcaster content that we can see and feel for a different reason. Reporting news still happens, but you might barely notice it. If there is a press conference, reporters are there to ask questions. And it doesn't have to be of the president. Anytime anybody's doing a press conference, there are typically some reporters in the audience to ask follow-up questions after they've asked a question, and to hold the subject of the presser to account. Hopefully that happens. Does this always happen, though? No way. Some podcasters will present themselves as reporting entities. One of the older such projects is the TYT network, the Young Turks network, which presents itself as co-anchors, as a co-anchors panel with a reporting block format. That is, they have different blocks that they talk about different topics, similar to a news format. And they actually hired reporters at one point to go into the field, mostly Washington, D.C., to do some actual reporting. So this is unusual. I guess when you get really popular and successful, they go hand in hand, perhaps. You can hire actual reporters. They focus almost entirely, if not entirely, on national politics. So the reporting staff could, and probably still is, small, if it still exists. Journalism, still a real thing. So I'm comparing a news analysis, which anyone can do, news reporting, which really requires a certain attention to detail and a budget to pay people, and actual journalism, which is a real profession with training and everything. It's still a real thing, at least for now. Investigative journalists, investigative journalists are the bedrock on which the population may hope to depend when it comes to understanding the state of the union, what their leaders say they're doing, what they are actually doing, who is feeling the pains from what they are doing, and so on. Let's run down a few of the bullet items from the Columbia Journalism class itinerary, the agenda, the syllabus. So the program, I'm reading now from their website. By the way, it's $7,500 for a 21-day course. So the program covers how to develop investigative story ideas. I'm going to jump down. I'm not going to read all of them. There are about 8 bullets. How to interview sources for stories, including those reluctant to talk. How to tell an investigation across media platforms. How to structure and write the long-form narrative. Typically, real investigative journalism will span multiple articles, multiple interviews, multiple conversations, multiple presentations, etc. It's usually an ongoing deep dive. Throughout the program, I only read, 4 of the 8. Throughout the program, faculty provide instruction on using digital tools, how to find data and acquire, clean, and analyze it. You can't just Google other people's work. How to use data to build an investigative story and drive shoe leather reporting. What is that? What is that? Oh, you mean I get away from my computer and I go out into the world and interact with other people and read documents and take photos of suspicious things and so on and so on. Speak to people behind shadows. Get the scoop. How to find the human face behind the data and connect findings to people on the ground, and how to mine social media, video sharing feeds, and other open sources for information. Now, those first two, you would think, oh, anybody does that. But it's the other open sources for information. So when you look at open source intelligence, open source information in general, you're not talking about software. You're talking about information that's generally available, that's not hidden away. It's not locked in a file cabinet. It doesn't require a security clearance. Anyone can consume open sources of information. So they say sometimes open source intelligence is a good source for, our actual intelligence agencies to make use of. You can actually look at information that's generally available and put those together. So you're applying your investigative powers to construct a picture of what's happening. Another critical component of the program will explore how journalists and media partners collaborate on investigative projects to produce more ambitious stories with wider impact. So you're essentially learning how to be, in a 21-day program, this is probably something that would only be considered the beginning of the beginning, but how to be an investigative journalist. It doesn't mean injecting your opinion, which is so often the case now. Hopefully it means finding the facts, open source facts, facts that you have to convince a reluctant individual to share, and so on. You construct a larger narrative based on facts and discussion, interviews, analysis, investigation. I don't know how many new media content creators are doing that. So everything is reaction now. Podcasters, again, using that as a general term, need content. They, and I will say we, I'll call myself a new media content creator. I'm not really doing so much. Well, I'm doing more analysis, I suppose. We always need something to talk about, to present, to invite our audience to consume, so we don't wander. You, my audience, they don't wander away and find something more interesting. It seems there are 3 choices if we are not paying for real reporters, even more expensive and legit professional journalists. So I'm not paying either of those class of professionals to do real field engagement and investigation. So without those, it kind of comes down to talk about things we know about. I can talk about computers all day myself, and I could have guests on to talk about computers. There are a few other topic areas I would put in this column, and most people creating content have this to fall back on. So you're good at something, you have some expertise, you have some subject matter expertise. I would say is it comes with experience, it comes with academic training, it comes with practical learning, practical knowing. So I think everybody has something they can talk about, and then there's you can comment on news of the day. That's item 2. Whatever the focus area, could be local news, sports, the weather, international issues, just about anything. By going over what others have published and summarize or analyze what they have published. So you take the news of the day, which is typically published on some sort of mainstream media platform, or you can take the news as described by other new media content creators, other podcasters, who are presenting their own take. Now, it would be interesting here, but I don't think the infrastructure is in place, if there were podcasters who had subject matter expertise, who were commenting on news of the day. And I mean, this does happen, but I don't know if there's a structured methodology. So if let's take Legal Eagle, I can't remember the guy's name. He's an attorney. So he will comment on news of the day. but he's an actual attorney. So his commentary is based on actual legal references. So he'll look up legal codes, he'll look up statutes, he'll say, hey, this is a violation of this, and this is the procedure for that, and so on. So he's applying his subject matter expertise to comment on news of the day. What does impeachment mean? What does it mean to grant a pardon? What does it mean to file a lawsuit? What happens when someone is arrested for committing this crime? And then what's the problem? So there are details he can go into based on his actual subject matter expertise, which is the result of his being an actual attorney, an actual JD, right? A practicing attorney in the region where he practices. So that means and I believe he disclaims this frequently, he does a particular type of law practice. So some of his commentary is based on general knowledge of the law as part of his academic background. He doesn't necessarily perform all forms of criminal and civil representation. So that is a possibility, though. And there are plenty. There are plenty of science explainers, science communicators. There are plenty of various quality. Invite guests to talk about their areas of expertise. That's item 3. So if you are not an expert yourself, you invite someone to come and talk about it, which is, of course, what I'm doing here as well. Hey, we can talk about news sources. I'm not a professional journalist, but I consume journalism, and I can tell the difference, so that's a start. But I'm not a professional journalist. So you find someone with a particular area of expertise or interest, and there is a difference. You can be an expert at something or interested. I am interested in all of the things that I have made topics for the FFS Talk audio program, not necessarily an expert in any of them. And I or the host or hosts can be their foil. So you can drive questions on behalf of the audience and generally engage in a sort of a student mode. Like, hey, you're here to teach me more about what you know more than I do about. That really sounds like two choices, right? As a content creator, I can be my own source and apply my subject matter expertise to external resources like written articles or other media content or guest interviews on other media outlets and discussions along the lines of my areas of confidence. So the things that I feel confident talking about, whether I'm an expert or not. Dunning-Kruger for the win. Or I can react to external issues, articles, and other content, and even with guests acting as a student foil without any particular insider knowledge. I represent the audience, if I can speak. I am just a regular person asking questions and expressing opinions. So that's kind of the two sides of the coin. Sometimes it's difficult to split them. For that latter case, though, as a particular content creator develops an audience and that audience develops a trust in the content creator, the commentary, the opining, the conversations that are probably casual and generally friendly, these types of content creators, if I may generalize, can become amplifiers, repeating ideas without much in the way of analysis or pushback, as they say, so that myths or disinformation can begin to creep into the public discourse without much in the way of resistance. And we saw this during the election cycle. If you sit down with podcasters, they're happy to have you. They're very excited because they make the news and they build their audience. They are ill-equipped, usually, with the deep understanding and knowledge of nuanced topics that are important to the electorate. So they pretend instead to just be a regular person and ask regular questions. And so you get a human interaction, which makes any candidate look good. And you can say presidential, but this is true of several politicians. If they participate in a podcast format, they come across as very normal. They're normal people. The content creators, the podcasters, the hosts of the shows don't always come prepared with facts, details, nuance, a deeper knowledge of how government functions, whether it's federal or state, etc. So when you come on without the background knowledge to counter, to push back, to follow up, the guests perhaps, can sort of take control of the narrative and can present their story to the general public that's listening, the audience, and it can come across as just a normal everyday conversation. So it's tricky, but And it's easy to fall into that. Call it analysis, call it reporting, call it interviewing, but it's often not quite what those terms imply. There's really no analysis. There's really not reporting. It's sort of interviewing, but it's really more conversation than question answer. And so it comes across as very relatable. Hey, that's not such a bad person, because they controlled the messaging. And this happened. This is not one political party or another. This is just the nature of how this works. Hey, here's an opportunity for me to engage an audience without much pushback. I'll take it. That's just how the game is played. What about those comments? When I was working at salon.com, I was working there when it was 10 years old. It was a publicly traded .com. It was the first .com I had ever worked at, believe it or not. In all my time at Silicon Valley, I was mostly into hardware. It was a left-leaning online magazine, of course. It's the only .com I worked at, as I said. So we implemented a user commenting system. That was basically why I joined, to turn a letters to the editor feature, which would tend to go through a review process, and maybe one or two of these submissions from the readership would make it into their publication, which was all. There was a time during the 10 years before I was there that they had a print version. I don't think that lasted very long. So it became open season on reader feedback and whatnot when we implemented this feature. So it's comments. Everybody has comments nowadays, but this was fairly new back in 2005. The question raised by the professional reporters and journalists and columnists that were on staff or working, submitting their works for money to the publication was, how are these people placing their ideas on the same webpage as mine without anybody checking anything? You know what? They were basically correct. And I have mentioned that a few times to anyone from that era with whom I am still in contact. Their concerns were valid. At the time, it didn't seem like it. Oh, anybody can say whatever they want. But when you look retrospectively, I think that was it's one thing to have people casually conversing in a online forum, but when you attach it to actual professional journalism, you can sometimes conflate the two, that all opinions expressed on this page are valid. Now, it is valid to have opinions, but there's a substantial difference between someone who has been paid to do real research and has the background and experience and academic training and so on to perform that task, and someone who says, I don't like it, and then has their own theories because they've done their own research. It still makes me laugh to this day. So most people will point out that YouTube comments in particular, but comments on social media in general, can really become vitriolic and worse, believe it or not. Worse than that even, which often leads to the content creators ignoring comments. Not always, but it probably depends on the audience. And you hear them say it, they'll write it sometimes. If they do interact with comments, there are, if you happen to make a comment on a YouTube video, and I do it sparingly myself, you can see that they don't necessarily go through and, if you can skim through comments on YouTube or any TikTok, Instagram, any of these things. Not everybody is there to create a discussion environment, to contribute to a conversation, to offer their own view, but a view that is learned, that has some sort of nuance to it, to elevate the conversation. That's not always the goal. Sometimes it's just pure trolling, which is unfortunate. So when comments, and maybe chat in some cases for live streamers in these modern times, are problematic, actual conversation is usually quashed, especially if those submitting their feedback turn on each other, which is also common. So replies to replies can certainly turn into sniping and worse. So that actual legitimate and possibly valuable pushback on the presentation itself may never surface for consideration. So if you have an interesting, you can find, I found this even recently, commentary is made, the title of a video is presented as such, and it's of course meant to be attractive. I'm using that as a provocative. How about that? A provocative title, clickbait. And the title was wrong. So I posted a comment and said, hey, here's how this actually happened. So the author, the creator, changed the title and said, okay, I'll change it to this. So it's not quite so obtuse, but that's rare. So I was offering constructive feedback, and we had one or two messages back and forth, and that is constructive, I think, but it's not always like that, and that's unfortunate. These are the times in which we find ourselves. So what happens if or when there's the big shakeup? So if the statistics are pointing toward the conclusion everybody is talking about, the age of reliable and trustworthy mainstream media, I wrote the age, I should say the days. Let me correct that. Okay, take two. The days of reliable and trustworthy mainstream media may be numbered, or they may already be over, as more and more people turn to what we could call independent news media, which is a segment of content creator effort, while at the same time expressing distrust for and consuming less of the legacy mainstream. So not only are people saying, oh, the mainstream media is untrustworthy, I don't like it, they're also not watching. So the ratings are going down, and the perception is basically gone at this point. And even a reasonably detached judge could look at some of the reporting that took place just during the 2024 election cycle and wonder what the motivations are, why is this method, why is this approach why is there such a difference between the different viewpoints and so on. So it's interesting times. And as we have discussed, few of the independent media are paying reporters or investigative journalists to research ongoing events and issues. And it is arguable that they do not independently prepare sufficiently for interviews or conversations, if you like, to counter or push back against claims their guests might assert, which again turns a content creator platform into an amplifier for whatever the guest would like to present. This is, if you don't see this, I'm sorry. It's plain, it's obvious, there's simply no getting around it. Now you will sometimes, well, let me read what I've written first and I'll comment. If there are fewer and fewer professionals, that is paid people, paid reporters and journalists doing the work of interviewing and researching and engaging news and newsmakers, on what will content creators base their so-called reporting, and how will they be able to consider themselves new media in terms of news reporting if there is no news gathering and investigation? Perhaps they will simply react to each other's opinions or to the interviews that they have with those who want to take yet more advantage of their audience reach to spread their message in a conversational manner. Conversational marketing is an actual thing, by the way. So, yeah, unless news platforms, TYT was the example. I don't necessarily like TYT, but I do know that they were very excited many years ago to hire a reporter, probably during the 2020 election news cycle. News cycle is kind of a euphemism, I guess. But they did have at least one paid person to actually conduct interviews, to be on the ground in Washington, D.C. Now, during an election, it probably wasn't during an election because not much is happening in D.C. during an election. But whenever it was, I don't know if they still pay reporters. But you will definitely find more and more commentary is in the form of reaction to other discussions, other reporting, other presentations. So there's an opportunity for the snake to eat its own tail, as they say with artificial intelligence. So when artificial intelligence begins training itself on its own output, we will see a marked decline in quality of what we think we're getting in ChatGPT or whatever. I will say I really don't use those, so I've tried them. I've checked out ChatGPT back in the 3.5 days, and I'm sure it's gotten vastly better, whatever better means. What will be interesting is, can GPT, or any of these LLMs, large language models, can they interview a person? Can they do the investigative journalism function? There's more to it than interviewing people, but can they originate new ideas and initiate an investigative effort? That will be interesting to tell over the next coming years. Now, what comes next? Arguably true, mainstream media has given up the notion of being independent, as in politically independent. They're still corporations, right? Trustworthy, reliable, the necessary external component of our democratic republic. The fourth estate, as it's called, has issues. And we see some journalists, reporters, and columnists going independent, that is, away from the corporations, on platforms like Substack and Ghost and others to offer paid subscriptions to their works. They also tend to be active on social media and in their own name. So rather than being a representative of a third party like New York Times or Washington Post or Fox News or whatever, there are those who still work for those companies. But you can break away. You can develop your own online presence. And then if you break away from the New York Times or the Fox News or the MSNBC, you retain your following, you retain your audience. So I think it's becoming more common to insist that I retain my social media presence in my own name. This is not always true at local news levels. You often see local reporters, local news personalities. They'll attach John Doe, ABCLV or whatever. They'll make it clear that they are a local reporter for a local news channel. Now, they can always change their name. So it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds into the future. But yeah, having your own Substack or Ghost as a potential for monetization. Patreon, similar. You can use Patreon to monetize some of your work. They offer paid subscriptions. Pays the bills. We see this nearly universally now with our new media presenters making use of original reporting from mainstream media for free, right? They just take the reporting and do their own meta reporting on it. Meta-analysis. What happens when the sources are now publishing to these platforms like Ghost and Substack and behind a Patreon paywall, generally behind a paywall, publishing these platforms in order to pay their bills, to make a living, to survive their career choice for the sake of an informed public. The subscriber model works if each reader subscribes. Obviously some percentage, but it's nice if it's more than zero. It is not intended to have one paying or non-paying consumer of the content using that content to engage their own audience. I actually see this too often with some online outlets. They will literally read through news articles and make an entire YouTube presentation. So it's a a weekly news rundown or something, and they'll read paywall articles. So they either get around the paywall, there are ways to do that, or they just read the headline and then they use some other familiarity so they don't actually read the story. So the take home is that they're producing monetizable content on the unmonetized content of other outlets, other sources. So the ethics of that are, if we're kind, we'll say they're in the gray area, but technically you are not compensating the people who are doing the work for you, and you are monetizing their work for yourself. As we, as a news interested audience, will need to decide, this is the last item, I promise, we will need to decide how we value being informed by trustworthy and reliable sources who actually tackle the journalist profession with skill, attention, and ethics, or maybe the most entertaining content production by a street, and ethics, or maybe the most entertaining content creator that feeds our own notions and confirmation of our own biases. Which is it going to be? Given where we are now, I'm afraid we already know the answer. The question is, will we change it? So yeah, the question is, does the let's say the electorate or the general population, does everyone prefer to be entertained to being informed? Now, you can be entertained, and I do like a lot of Jon Stewart, not all of Jon Stewart, but Jon Stewart kind of set the bar with The Daily Show. He also invented the dodge. Hey, I'm just a comedian. What do I know? But people are consuming The Daily Show as though it were actual news, because they do provide actual news. They provide a highly editorialized view of the news, which is fine. They're doing news analysis. However, they also send reporters into the field. Granted, they're comedians, but they're actually talking to people and they're leaving the building. There's something to be said for that. They work for a comedy network. But if you ignore these things and you simply say, oh, that is where I get my news from, it's troubling, but it is the state of affairs. If you get your news from Joe Rogan or from, which I guess everybody does, or from Sam Cedar or Hassan Abi or Vosh or Destiny, if you go to Lex Friedman for the hard-hitting interviews, if you are listening to Glenn Beck or you're consuming Sean Hannity, I think he still has a radio show. So there are people that are doing their own independent, because Sean Hannity is still on Fox News. But either way, however you consume your news, wherever it's coming from, do be aware that sometimes you are getting pure opinion. Sometimes you're getting pure reaction. You're not getting real reporting. You're not getting legitimate journalism. This doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon, but awareness could make a difference, and that is even dubious. Do I sound pessimistic? I should, because I am. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. A 45-minute episode by the timer here. It will probably get chopped down a bit from I truncate silence, which will take any period of silence longer than 0.7 seconds and chop it. So this prevents you from having to sit through my long pauses when I'm looking something up or editing, or sometimes they make it through. Sometimes you'll have something a little bit longer than that, but for the most part, this show will probably come closer to 40 minutes, but we'll find out. There you go. Don't forget to check out buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo to track down some of my other audio productions and other projects. And don't forget to buy me an update every Monday morning now in the posts section. Buy Me a Coffee enables audio posts, and so I'm doing that. Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo for little text updates. Getting more into these recently. Take care. We'll see you next week, or you'll hear me next week.